The clock on the dashboard read 9:45 p.m. as a silver Honda Accord cruised smoothly down Cedar Avenue. Behind the wheel sat a distinguished federal prosecutor with salt and pepper hair at his temples, his tie loosened after another marathon day at the office. The streetlights cast gentle shadows across his tired but focused face as he mentally reviewed the major case he'd been preparing for weeks. The peaceful drive home was suddenly interrupted by flashing blue and red lights in his rearview mirror. With 15 years of experience in law enforcement and justice under his belt, he knew exactly what to do. Carefully, he turned on his hazard lights to acknowledge the officer, then pulled over to the curb, positioning his car at a slight angle to protect both himself and the approaching officer from passing traffic. As he waited, he did everything by the book. Hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, interior light switched on, and engine turned off. Through his side mirror, he watched the police officer approach, noting how the officer's hand rested near his holster, a detail that made his heart sink a little. He'd seen this body language before, too many times to count. License and registration, the officer demanded without so much as a greeting, his flashlight beam uncomfortably bright through the driver's window. The prosecutor kept his movements slow and deliberate, narrating each action. "I'm reaching for my wallet in my back pocket, then I'll get the registration from the glove compartment." The officer's stance remained rigid, suspicious. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" "No, sir, I don't. I was maintaining the speed limit and following all traffic rules." "You were doing 35 in a school zone," the officer stated firmly, though there hadn't been any school zone signs for the past 3 miles. "Sir, with all due respect, I believe there might be a mistake. The nearest school zone ended several miles back, and I'm certain I was traveling at the posted speed limit of 30. The officer's flashlight beam moved deliberately around the car's interior, lingering on the briefcase in the passenger seat and the stack of legal documents visible inside. His tone grew more confrontational. "Are you trying to tell me how to do my job?" "Not at all, sir. I'm simply stating what I observed. Would it be possible to see the radar reading?" The request was met with a scoff. Step out of the vehicle. What should have been a routine traffic stop was quickly escalating into something more concerning. The prosecutor knew this dance all too well, not as a participant, but as someone who had prosecuted cases where similar scenarios had gone terribly wrong. He remained calm but firm. "Officer, I don't believe that's necessary. I'm happy to discuss this matter professionally." "I said, step out of the vehicle," the officer repeated, his hand now fully resting on its holster. With measured movements, the prosecutor complied, emerging into the cool night air. He stood nearly 6 feet tall in his business casual attire, khakis and a light blue button-down shirt, with the sleeves rolled up after his long day at work. The officer seemed slightly taken aback by his professional demeanor, but pressed on with increasingly aggressive questioning about where he was coming from, where he was headed, and whether the car belonged to him. Throughout the interrogation, the prosecutor maintained his composure, answering each question truthfully and respectfully while feeling the familiar weight of unfair judgments settling on his shoulders. He'd lost count of how many times he experienced this. The assumptions, the unwarranted suspicion, the subtle and not so subtle signs of prejudice. After what felt like an eternity of questioning, the officer returned to his patrol car with the prosecutor's license and registration. The wait stretched on for 15 long minutes, an unusually long time for a simple traffic stop. Finally, the officer returned, holding not just a ticket, but a court summons. "You're being cited for speeding in a school zone and failing to provide proper vehicle documentation," the officer announced, though all required documents had been provided. "Your court date is next Tuesday at 9 a.m. Do not miss it." As the prosecutor accepted the paperwork, he noticed the officer's nameplate and badge number, mentally noting them for future reference. He knew this wasn't the time or place to argue. Years of experience had taught him that sometimes the best response to injustice is to fight it through proper channels, where evidence and truth could speak louder than prejudice. Watching the patrol car pull away, he took a deep breath and looked at the court summons in his hand. A slight smile crossed his face, not of amusement, but of determination. Little did anyone know that this routine traffic stop was about to become a catalyst for change in the local justice system. As he carefully pulled back onto the road, he was already planning his approach for court day, knowing that sometimes the most powerful statements are made not through confrontation, but through quiet, dignified revelation of truth. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as people slowly filtered through the heavy wooden doors. It was just before 8:30 a.m., and the federal prosecutor had deliberately arrived early, dressed differently than his usual courtroom attire. Instead of his typical tailored suit, he wore a simple polo shirt and pressed khakis, clothes that would let him blend in with the other citizens arriving for their traffic court appearances. Taking a seat in the back row of the crowded courtroom, he pulled out a small notebook and pen. His years of experience had taught him to document everything, and today would be no different. The wooden bench was uncomfortable, but it gave him a perfect view of the proceedings. The air conditioning hummed softly overhead, barely masking the nervous whispers of people around him. A young woman sat next to him, clutching a crumpled ticket in trembling hands. "First time here?" he asked kindly. She nodded, explaining she couldn't afford the ticket on her waitress's salary. He listened thoughtfully, noting how her story echoed countless others he'd heard throughout his career. As the clock struck 9:00 a.m., a side door opened, and Judge Stanford strode in. The bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise." The prosecutor observed the judge carefully as everyone stood. He'd heard rumors about this particular judge, but he wanted to see for himself. What unfolded over the next hour was both fascinating and disturbing. The prosecutor watched as case after case was called. A pattern emerged that made his stomach turn. A well-dressed business executive talked his way out of a parking ticket with a joke about golf that the judge seemed to appreciate. Minutes later, a factory worker's reasonable explanation about a broken taillight was dismissed with barely a glance. He noticed how the judge's tone shifted depending on who stood before him. Some received patient hearings and understanding nods, while others faced rapid-fire questions and skeptical looks. The prosecutor jotted down times, case numbers, and outcomes, his training helping him spot the subtle inconsistencies in how justice was being administered. The young waitress beside him was called up. Her voice shook as she tried to explain her situation, asking for a payment plan. The judge cut her off mid-sentence, demanding full payment by the end of the month. She returned to her seat with tears in her eyes, wondering aloud how she would manage to pay both the fine and her rent. A middle-aged man in a business suit entered late, disrupting the proceedings. Instead of the stern rebuke others had received for similar tardiness, the judge warmly welcomed him, even joking about morning traffic. The prosecutor's pen moved quickly across his notebook, documenting each interaction, each inconsistency, each subtle sign of bias. He watched an elderly gentleman try to explain that his handicap placard had fallen from his rearview mirror, only to be interrupted repeatedly and ultimately fined the maximum amount. The man's shoulders slumped as he slowly made his way back through the courtroom, leaning heavily on his cane. As the morning wore on, the prosecutor's notebook filled with observations. He noted how some people were allowed to fully explain their situations, while others were barely permitted to speak. He documented the varying tones, the different levels of patience, the subtle facial expressions that revealed underlying biases. The young mother with 3 kids who arrived slightly late was scolded harshly, while the golf club member who arrived even later was greeted with a smile. The college student with dyed hair and piercings was treated with obvious disdain, while the clean-cut banker was given every benefit of the doubt. Each case added another piece to a troubling puzzle. The prosecutor felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. As a federal prosecutor, he had sworn to uphold justice equally for all, and what he was witnessing flew in the face of everything the justice system was supposed to represent. He thought about all the cases he'd prosecuted over the years, all the times he'd stood before judges arguing for fair treatment under the law. Now, sitting in this crowded courtroom, he was seeing the other side, the everyday citizens who faced an uphill battle simply because of who they were or how they looked. The bailiff called a brief recess, and the prosecutor stepped out into the hallway. He pulled out his phone, quickly typing out some notes to himself. He knew his own case would be called soon, and a plan was forming in his mind. This wasn't just about his traffic ticket anymore, it was about something much bigger. As people filed back into the courtroom, he overheard snippets of conversation. Frustrated voices discussing the unfairness they'd witnessed, resigned sighs from those who felt powerless to challenge the system. He thought about the young waitress, the elderly gentleman, the mother with her children, and all the others who had faced subtle but significant bias in what was supposed to be a hall of justice. His case would be called soon, and he was ready. Sometimes the most powerful statements are made not through loud protests or angry confrontations, but through quiet, dignified revelation of truth. He straightened his polo shirt and checked his watch. The time for change was approaching, and he was prepared to be its catalyst. After the recess, the tension in the courtroom seemed to thicken. The federal prosecutor's fingers traced the edge of his ticket as he waited for his case to be called. Around him, the wooden benches had slowly emptied as case after case was processed, leaving behind only a handful of nervous defendants and a few court staff members. Case number 247, the bailiff's voice echoed through the chamber. Speeding violation in a school zone. The prosecutor rose calmly, straightening his polo shirt as he approached the podium. Judge Stanford barely glanced up from his papers, his reading glasses perched low on his nose. The afternoon sun streaming through the high windows cast harsh shadows across the judge's face, highlighting the bored expression he wore. "Good afternoon, Your Honor," the prosecutor began politely. "Let's make this quick," Judge Stanford interrupted, still not looking up. "I have a full docket today. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, Your Honor. If I may explain." The judge's head snapped up, his expression shifting from boredom to irritation. "The officer's report clearly states you were traveling 35 miles per hour in a clearly marked school zone. Are you suggesting the officer was mistaken?" "Yes, Your Honor. I believe there was an error." "I'd like to present evidence that—" "Evidence?" The judge's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Do you have any idea how many people come in here claiming they weren't speeding? The officer's word is good enough for this court." The prosecutor remained steady, his voice calm but firm. "Your Honor, I understand the court's time is valuable, but I have the right to present my case. First, I'd like to point out that there was no operational school zone at the time of—" "I don't need a lecture on traffic laws," Judge Stanford cut in, his voice rising slightly. A few heads in the gallery turned to watch the exchange. "The fact is, you were caught speeding in a school zone. The fine is $300 plus court costs. Your Honor, with all due respect, I believe you're required by law to allow me to present my defense. The traffic stop occurred at 9:45 p.m., well outside any school zone hours, and the nearest school zone actually ended 3 miles before." The judge's gavel cracked against the wooden block. "Are you telling me how to run my courtroom?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implied threat. The prosecutor took a deep breath, maintaining his composure. "No, Your Honor. I'm simply exercising my right to present evidence in my defense. Additionally, I'd like to note for the record that the officer failed to provide radar confirmation when requested." "For the record?" Judge Stanford's eyebrows rose as he leaned forward. "Listen here, I've been presiding over this court for 15 years, and I don't need someone like you telling me about proper procedures." The word "someone like you" echoed through the courtroom. A few gasps came from the gallery, where the remaining observers sat forward in their seats, sensing the growing tension. Furthermore, the prosecutor continued, his voice steady despite the judge's mounting hostility, "I have documentation showing that the specific location where I was stopped has no school zone designation at all. I've brought satellite imagery and municipal zoning maps to verify this fact." "Enough." The judge's face had reddened. "Your attitude is bordering on contempt. The fine is now $500 plus court costs. Pay the clerk on your way out." The prosecutor stood perfectly still, his hands folded calmly in front of him. The afternoon sun caught his face as he looked directly at the judge, his expression neither angry nor intimidated. The courtroom had gone completely silent, every eye fixed on this unexpected confrontation. "Your Honor," he began again, his voice clear and measured, "before we proceed with that fine, I believe it's important to note several procedural irregularities in today's proceedings. First, you've denied my right to present evidence. Second, you've increased my fine without proper cause. And third, you've demonstrated what appears to be personal bias in your handling of this case." Judge Stanford's knuckles whitened as he gripped his gavel. "One more word, and I'll hold you in contempt. You can spend the weekend in jail thinking about your attitude." The moment had arrived. The prosecutor reached slowly into his back pocket, maintaining eye contact with the judge. "In that case, Your Honor, I should probably introduce myself properly." He pulled out his credentials, the gold badge catching the sunlight. "I'm an assistant United States attorney for the Department of Justice, and I've been observing your courtroom procedures all morning." The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Stanford's face drained of color as he stared at the badge, his mouth slightly open. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably, and a quiet murmur rippled through the remaining spectators. "I've documented numerous instances of what appear to be biased rulings and procedural violations," the prosecutor continued calmly. "I believe it would be in everyone's best interest to revisit not only my case, but several others I've witnessed today. Of course, I'd be happy to bring these concerns to the Judicial Review Board's attention if you prefer." The gavel in Judge Stanford's hand trembled slightly as the full impact of the situation dawned on him. The afternoon sun continued to stream through the windows, illuminating dust particles that danced in the suddenly charged air of the courtroom, as justice itself seemed to hang in the balance. The courtroom seemed frozen in time. Judge Stanford's hand rested limply on his gavel, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning dew under a hot sun. The federal prosecutor's credentials continued to catch the light, the gold badge a silent testament to years of dedication to justice. In the gallery, the remaining observers sat perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. The young waitress from earlier had her hand pressed to her mouth, eyes wide with surprise. The elderly gentleman with the handicap placard leaned forward in his seat, his cane forgotten at his feet. I wasn't aware of your position," Judge Stanford finally managed, his voice having lost its earlier authoritative boom. He fumbled with his reading glasses, as if seeing the man before him for the first time. "No, Your Honor, you weren't," the prosecutor replied calmly. "And that's precisely the point. My position shouldn't matter. Every person who walks into this courtroom deserves the same respect and consideration under the law." He opened his notebook, the pages filled with careful observations from the morning's proceedings. "Should we discuss the young woman who needed a payment plan and was denied even the chance to explain her situation? Or perhaps the elderly gentleman with a valid reason for his handicap placard issue? Or shall we talk about how you welcomed late arrivals from certain members of the community while harshly penalizing others for the same offense?" The court reporter's fingers hovered over her keyboard, uncertain whether to continue recording. The bailiff shifted his weight from one foot to the other, looking between the judge and the prosecutor like someone watching a tennis match. "I assure you there's been no intentional," Judge Stanford began, but his voice trailed off as the prosecutor raised a single finger. "With all due respect, Your Honor, intent isn't the only issue here. The pattern of behavior I've documented today suggests a systemic bias in how justice is being administered in this courtroom." He paused, letting his words sink in. "As you noted earlier, you've been presiding over this court for 15 years. I wonder how many lives have been affected by these, let's call them inconsistencies in judgment." A drop of sweat rolled down Judge Stanford's temple. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the courtroom, but the heat the judge felt had nothing to do with the weather. "The good news," the prosecutor continued, his voice taking on a more constructive tone, "is that we have an opportunity here. An opportunity to acknowledge these issues and address them properly. To make real changes that will benefit everyone who seeks justice in this courthouse." He closed his notebook deliberately. "I'm prepared to file a detailed report with the Judicial Review Board, complete with timestamps, case numbers, and specific examples of discriminatory treatment." He let that sink in before adding, "However, I'm also prepared to work with you and the court administration to develop better protocols and training programs. The choice, Your Honor, is yours." The silence that followed was broken only by the soft whir of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic outside. Judge Stanford removed his reading glasses entirely, rubbing the bridge of his nose with trembling fingers. "I've always prided myself on being fair," the judge said quietly, almost to himself. The words hung in the air, a sharp contrast of his actions throughout the day. "Then let's work on making sure that pride is justified," the prosecutor responded, his voice firm but not unkind. "Starting with today's cases." Judge Stanford looked out at the remaining people in his courtroom, The waitress, the elderly man, the young mother with her children fidgeting quietly in the back row. For perhaps the first time, he really saw them, not as cases to be processed, but as people seeking justice. "Bailiff," the judge called out, his voice catching slightly. "Please recall all of today's cases. We'll be reviewing each one." He turned back to the prosecutor. "And your traffic ticket is dismissed." "Thank you, Your Honor," the prosecutor replied, "but I'm not concerned about my ticket. I'm concerned about ensuring equal justice for everyone who comes through those doors." He gestured to the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom. "Perhaps we should discuss how to make that happen." The remaining observers watched in amazement as Judge Stanford nodded slowly, then stood up from his bench. "My chambers," he said quietly. "We have a lot to talk about." As the prosecutor gathered his materials, he felt a light touch on his arm. It was the young waitress, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Behind her, the elderly gentleman nodded in appreciation, and others in the gallery smiled their gratitude. The prosecutor nodded, acknowledging their thanks, but his expression remained serious. This wasn't about one afternoon's victory. It was about ensuring that justice truly would be blind, treating everyone with equal respect regardless of their appearance or position. As he followed Judge Stanford toward his chambers, he knew this was just the beginning of a much longer journey toward real change. News travels fast in a small courthouse. By the next morning, whispers of what had happened in Judge Stanford's courtroom were spreading like wildfire through the legal community. The story gained momentum as different versions circulated through courthouse corridors, law offices, and coffee shops around town. "Did you hear what happened in traffic court?" A clerk whispered to her colleague over morning coffee in the courthouse cafeteria. A federal prosecutor exposed everything. Their conversation was just one of many happening throughout the building. The local newspaper's court reporter, who had been dozing through what he thought would be another routine afternoon of traffic cases, found himself with the biggest story of his career. His article, appearing on the front page of the morning edition, carried the headline, "Federal Prosecutor Challenges Local Judge's Bias in Traffic Court." The story struck a chord with readers. The newspaper's website crashed twice from the traffic as people shared the article on social media. Comments flooded in from hundreds of local residents, many sharing their own experiences with unfair treatment in traffic court. By midday, 3 local TV stations had parked their vans outside the courthouse, reporters standing ready with their microphones. "We're here live outside the county courthouse," one reporter began her broadcast, where yesterday, a routine traffic ticket hearing turned into a moment of reckoning for our local justice system. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was electric with tension and anticipation. Court staff who had witnessed the confrontation found themselves surrounded by curious colleagues during lunch breaks, everyone eager to hear first-hand accounts of what had transpired. "You should have seen the judge's face," one bailiff told his captivated audience in the break room. "When that prosecutor pulled out his credentials, I thought the judge was going to fall right out of his chair." The story was repeated and shared, each telling adding to its impact. The young waitress who had been in the courtroom that day arrived home to find her phone buzzing with messages. A local news reporter had tracked her down, wanting to hear her story about the payment plan denial and how the prosecutor had stood up for everyone in the courtroom. "It wasn't just about him," she told the reporter, her voice trembling with emotion. "He spoke up for all of us who felt powerless. For the first time, someone with authority saw what was happening and did something about it." The elderly gentleman with the handicap placard issue received a call from the court clerk's office that afternoon. His case was being reviewed, and his fine was being reconsidered. As he hung up the phone, he sat in his favorite chair, wiping tears from his eyes. Finally, he whispered to his empty living room. Someone listened. The Judicial Review Board's office was flooded with calls and emails. People from all over the county began coming forward with their own stories of unfair treatment in Judge Stanford's courtroom. The board members found themselves facing mounting pressure to launch a formal investigation. Local civil rights organizations seized the moment, organizing community meetings to discuss experiences with the justice system. The community center's meeting room, usually empty on weekday evenings, was packed to capacity. People lined the walls, each waiting for their turn to speak. "For years, we felt like we were shouting into the void," one community leader addressed the crowd. "Now finally, Someone with power has shown that our voices matter, that justice should truly be blind. A group of law students from the nearby university began compiling data from court records, analyzing patterns in Judge Stanford's rulings over the years. Their preliminary findings were troubling, showing clear disparities in how different groups were treated. The prosecutor's office was suddenly inundated with interview requests from media outlets across the country. The story had struck a nerve, highlighting issues that resonated far beyond their small community. But the federal prosecutor declined all interviews, letting his actions in the courtroom speak for themselves. In the courthouse parking lot that evening, a young public defender caught up with a seasoned attorney. "Things feel different today," the younger lawyer observed, "like something's finally changing." The older attorney nodded, looking up at the courthouse building. "One person stood up and showed us all what real justice looks like," he replied. "Sometimes that's all it takes to start a movement." As the sun set behind the courthouse, casting long shadows across its stone steps, various groups gathered to discuss what would happen next. Community leaders, legal professionals, and ordinary citizens all knew that this wasn't just a one-day story. It was the beginning of a long-overdue conversation about fairness and equality in their justice system. The local coffee shop across from the courthouse stayed open late that night, its tables filled with people discussing the events. The owner, who had seen many stories come and go over the years, listened to the conversations around him and smiled. In all his years serving the courthouse crowd, he'd never seen anything unite the community quite like this. 1 week after the courtroom confrontation, the federal prosecutor sat in his office, reviewing dozens of letters that had flooded his desk. Each envelope contained a different story, but they all shared the same theme: people who had faced similar treatment in traffic court and other local courts, hoping that someone would finally listen. He picked up one letter, written in shaky handwriting from an 82-year-old retired teacher. She described how she'd been humiliated in court over a parking ticket, despite her clean driving record of 60 years. Another came from a young college student who had to drop out because excessive court fines had drained his tuition savings. Instead of using these stories to seek revenge or public acclaim, the prosecutor began drafting a proposal. His computer screen reflected in his glasses as he worked late into the evening, typing out a comprehensive plan for judicial reform. His office walls, lined with law books and case files, witnessed the birth of something that could change their community forever. "It's not about pointing fingers," he explained to his colleague the next morning, spreading the draft across his desk. "It's about fixing a system that's hurt too many people for too long." His proposal was straightforward but powerful: mandatory bias training for all court officials, regular reviews of judicial decisions to check for patterns of unfairness, and a new community feedback system that would give citizens a voice in their justice system. Down the hall, his phone rang. It was Judge Stanford's office. The judge wanted to meet, not in his chambers this time, but at a small coffee shop away from the courthouse. The prosecutor agreed, understanding that real change often starts with difficult conversations. The coffee shop was quiet when they met, morning rush hour already over. Judge Stanford looked different away from his bench, older, more human. His hands wrapped around his coffee cup as if seeking warmth, despite the mild weather. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," the judge began, his voice lacking its usual courtroom authority. "I've served on this bench for 15 years, telling myself I was being fair. But after what happened, I pulled my own records, looked at my own patterns, and..." He paused, struggling with the words. "I didn't like what I saw." The prosecutor listened quietly, letting the judge continue. "My grandfather was a judge too," Stanford went on. "I'd always wanted to live up to his legacy. But maybe I've been carrying forward old prejudices without even realizing it." He pulled out a folded piece of paper from his jacket. "I want to help make this right." It was a letter requesting to be part of the reform process. The judge had written it himself, admitting his mistakes and volunteering to help develop the new training programs. His hands trembled slightly as he handed it over. "This couldn't have been easy to write," the prosecutor said softly, accepting the letter. "Not as hard as facing myself in the mirror these past few days," the judge replied. That afternoon, the prosecutor called a meeting with local legal aid organizations. The conference room was packed. Public defenders, civil rights lawyers, community advocates, and even a few court clerks who had come on their lunch break. "We have a unique opportunity," he told the gathered group. This isn't about shame or blame. It's about building something better. He laid out the proposal, including Judge Stanford's letter. The room buzzed with energy as people began adding their own ideas and experiences. A young public defender raised her hand. "I've been keeping records of similar cases for years," she said, pulling out a thick folder. "Never thought anyone would want to see them." Others nodded, more documents appearing from bags and briefcases, years of documented inequities, finally finding their moment to make a difference. The prosecutor worked with local law schools to develop the training program. Students and professors dove into the project, analyzing cases, conducting research, and designing workshops that would help court officials recognize and overcome their hidden biases. Community members were invited to share their stories as part of the training. The elderly gentleman with the handicap placard spoke about dignity. The young waitress talked about the impact of unfair fines on working families. Their voices, once ignored in the courtroom, now became powerful tools for change. Judge Stanford's first day of training was watched closely by everyone. He sat in the front row, taking notes like a first-year law student. During breaks, he spoke with community members, really listening to their experiences for the first time. "I never knew," he admitted during one session, his voice heavy with realization. "I never let myself see how my decisions were affecting real people's lives." The prosecutor made sure the reforms went beyond just training. He worked with court administrators to create a new system for reviewing decisions, looking for patterns of bias before they could become entrenched. Regular community feedback sessions were scheduled, giving citizens a formal way to voice their concerns. Late one evening, as he was leaving the office, the prosecutor found a note slipped under his door. It was from the young waitress who had been in court that day. "Thank you," it read, "not just for standing up, but for helping make sure nobody else has to go through what we did." He pinned the note to his bulletin board next to his law school diploma and federal prosecutor credentials. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of courage, not in demanding justice for yourself, but in ensuring it for others. 6 months later, the grand ballroom of the State Judicial Conference Center buzzed with anticipation. Judges, lawyers, and court officials from across the state had gathered for what was becoming the most talked-about judicial reform presentation in recent memory. The young waitress, now employed as a community liaison for the court system, adjusted her new blazer nervously as she helped check in attendees. She couldn't help but smile, remembering how different things had been just half a year ago when she'd stood trembling before a traffic court judge. At the podium, Judge Stanford cleared his throat, looking out over the packed room. The federal prosecutor sat in the front row, giving an encouraging nod. The judge's hands trembled slightly as he began to speak. "6 months ago, I was forced to confront something ugly in myself," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. "I thought I was a fair judge. I convinced myself that my decisions were based purely on the law. But it took someone brave enough to stand up and show me my own bias for me to realize how wrong I was." The audience leaned forward, captivated by the unusual sight of a judge speaking so openly about his own failings. In the back of the room, several news cameras rolled silently, documenting this remarkable moment. The easy thing would have been to file a complaint and move on, Judge Stanford continued, gesturing toward the federal prosecutor. Instead, this man chose to work with us to help us create something that could make real change. Slides appeared on a large screen behind him, showing statistics from their courthouse over the past 6 months. The numbers told a striking story: dramatic reductions in disputed rulings, increased satisfaction from court users, and most importantly, equal treatment across all demographics in sentencing and fines. The elderly gentleman with the handicap placard, now serving on the Community Oversight Board, nodded in satisfaction from his seat. His case had become a teaching example in their training program, helping other judges understand the importance of listening to citizens' explanations. "But numbers only tell part of the story," the judge continued. "The real change has been in how we see the people who come before us." He paused, removing his glasses. "Every person who walks into our courtroom now knows they'll be heard, really heard, regardless of who they are or what they look like." The prosecutor watched as Judge Stanford described their new programs: the bias training workshops, the community feedback sessions, the regular review of court decisions for fairness. What had started as a confrontation in traffic court had grown into a model program that other jurisdictions were eager to adopt. During the break, people gathered around information tables in the lobby. Court clerks demonstrated their new system for tracking and reviewing judicial decisions. Community advocates shared stories of positive changes they'd witnessed. The young public defender who had shared her records now led a workshop on identifying systemic bias. "The most powerful moment for me," one judge from a neighboring county said during the afternoon session, "was when we started really listening to the people in our courtrooms, not just hearing their words, but understanding their stories." The federal prosecutor finally took the stage late in the afternoon. The room fell silent as he approached the podium, everyone eager to hear from the man who had sparked this transformation. "Justice isn't just about following the law," he began softly, forcing everyone to listen carefully. "It's about seeing the humanity in every person who stands before us. It's about remembering that behind every case number is a real person with real struggles and real dignity." He shared stories from the past 6 months: the single mother whose payment plan had helped her keep her job, the student who was able to return to college, the elderly couple who felt respected in court for the first time. Each story highlighted not just what had changed, but why it mattered. As the conference drew to a close, attendees lined up to receive their training materials and implementation guides. The prosecutor watched as judges from other districts eagerly discussed bringing these reforms to their own courtrooms. "You know," Judge Stanford said quietly, joining him by the window, "that day in traffic court, you could have just embarrassed me and filed a complaint. Why did you choose to help instead?" The prosecutor smiled, watching as the young waitress confidently directed people to their next sessions. "Because real change doesn't come from tearing people down," he replied. "It comes from helping them build something better." Outside the conference center, the setting sun painted the sky in brilliant colors. Participants lingered on the steps, exchanging contact information and making plans to implement what they'd learned. The elderly gentleman shook hands with judges who had once intimidated him, now equals in the work of improving their justice system. As people began to leave, carrying their materials and new ideas with them, the prosecutor felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The incident in traffic court could have been just another story of confrontation and punishment. Instead, it had become a catalyst for genuine change, touching lives far beyond their small courthouse. The young waitress approached him with a stack of feedback forms. "People keep asking when we're doing the next training," she said proudly. "They say they've never seen anything like this." He smiled, thinking of how far they'd come from that tense afternoon in traffic court. "Sometimes," he replied, "the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of courage." Looking out at the departing crowd, he added softly, "And they grow because people choose to build bridges instead of walls."